When Donald Trump landed in Kuala Lumpur for the ASEAN summit in late October 2025, Asia rolled out the red carpet, literally. Malaysia's Prime Minister greeted him at the foot of Air Force One and local dancers performed, prompting the US President to join in a brief red carpet dance. Such images, combined with peace deals and flashy trade signings, have given Trump's Asia tour the feel of a coronation. But beyond the spectacle lies a complex negotiation over trade, chips, rare earths, and even the US Constitution itself. Could Trump really return for a third presidential term, as his former strategist Steve Bannon told The Economist? How does Asia intend to handle a US leader who throws tariffs like confetti and expects applause in return? And why are global markets swinging wildly with every rumor from the negotiating table? In this deep dive, we unpack Trump's Asia tour, the crisis around chipmaker Nexperia, the strategic tussle over rare earths, the shifting global reserve game, and the political theater around a possible 2028 run. We'll explore how each thread ties together and what it reveals about the future of US-China relations. Along the way, we'll pose the questions many analysts are afraid to ask. Constitutional impossibilities and Bannon's third-term talk. Steve Bannon, once Trump's chief strategist, told The Economist that Trump is going to be president in 2028, and people ought to just get accommodated with that. He hinted at unnamed plans to get around the Constitution's 22nd Amendment. The amendment is clear. No person may be elected to the presidency more than twice. Yet Bannon promised that there's a plan. While critics warn such talk normalizes autocratic thinking, Trump himself has helped stoke this speculation. On the long flight to Asia, he told reporters aboard Air Force One that, "I would love to do it. I have my best numbers ever," when asked about running again. Asked if he was ruling out a third term, he answered cryptically, "You'll have to tell me." He later said he wouldn't run as vice president. The American public would not find it cute, but insisted his popularity might force the issue. These comments stoke the fire at home and abroad. In Washington, they have triggered legal debates over whether the 22nd Amendment could be sidestepped by serving as someone else's vice president or by finding other loopholes. Internationally, they signal to allies and rivals alike that US domestic politics might get even more unpredictable. What happens to global diplomacy when the world's most powerful office becomes a talking point in a constitutional loophole campaign? We should reflect on whether this is serious statecraft or just political theater. A tour wrapped in ceremony and deals. Trump's Asian itinerary reads like a carefully choreographed political drama. After Kuala Lumpur, the tour continued through Vietnam and Thailand before a high-stakes meeting with President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation (APEC) summit in Busan, South Korea. Each stop brought lavish welcomes and major announcements. The Malaysian leg. Within hours of landing in Kuala Lumpur for the ASEAN summit, Trump orchestrated a Cambodia-Thailand ceasefire signing, prompting Cambodia to nominate him for a Nobel Peace Prize. At the ceremony, Trump stood with Cambodian and Thai leaders beneath a backdrop emblazoned "Delivering Peace," celebrating his role as truce broker. Critics noted that the ceasefire had been largely brokered by Malaysian diplomats and was more a pathway towards peace than a formal treaty, but the optics served Trump's narrative. Trade deals abound. Kuala Lumpur produced 6 trade agreements. Malaysia, Thailand, and Cambodia pledged not to ban exports of critical minerals and rare earths to the United States. In exchange, the US would maintain a 19% tariff rate on most of their exports, but tariffs could drop to 0 on certain products. Vietnam secured unprecedented reciprocal market access. All 4 Southeast Asian countries agreed to curb subsidies, strengthen environmental and labor rules, and facilitate US access to critical minerals. Malaysia promised to invest $70 billion in the United States over 10 years and to purchase new Boeing aircraft, deals reminiscent of China's $37 billion Boeing order during Trump's first term. Trump's message to the ASEAN leaders was unequivocal. The United States is with you 100%, and we intend to be a strong partner for many generations. This charm offensive sought to counter Beijing's growing influence in Southeast Asia and to secure supply chains for minerals vital to electric vehicles, electronics, and defense, setting the stage for Trump-Xi talks. The Kuala Lumpur meetings also served a bigger objective, preparing the ground for a trade truce with China. US and Chinese negotiators held multiple sessions and agreed on a preliminary framework for Trump and Xi to consider. Officials on both sides stressed progress. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said the talks eliminated the immediate threat of Trump's 100% tariff on Chinese goods, while China's Vice Commerce Minister Li Chenggang said they had reached a preliminary consensus. The framework reportedly includes a pause on new US tariffs and a delay of China's latest rare earth export curbs, as well as renewed commitments to buy US soybeans and address fentanyl precursors. Are these deals genuine breakthroughs or just temporary truces? Past US-China trade truces have melted away amid domestic pressures. Why might this time be different? The chip crisis, Nexperia, and Europe's auto jitters. Even as Trump and Xi edged toward de-escalation, a separate chip crisis threatened to paralyze Europe's car industry. The saga centers on Nexperia, a Dutch chip maker owned by China's Wingtech. Nexperia produces basic but essential semiconductors, transistors, and diodes that are embedded in almost every modern vehicle. Around 70% of these chips are packaged in China before being shipped worldwide. In September 2025, the Dutch government seized control of Nexperia, citing governance concerns and fears that the company's Chinese management was gutting European operations and transferring intellectual property to China. Days later, China's Ministry of Commerce retaliated by blocking exports of Nexperia products from China. Automakers across Europe, the United States, and Japan immediately sounded the alarm. Deliveries of simple but high-volume chips were no longer guaranteed. The ACEA, Europe's Auto Association, warned that manufacturing could be significantly disrupted. In the United States, the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, which represents GM, Toyota, Ford, Volkswagen, Hyundai, and nearly every major car maker, said if the shipment of automotive chips doesn't resume quickly, it's going to disrupt auto production in the US and many other countries. Several automakers said their US plants could be affected as soon as the following month. For Europe, the stakes are enormous. The automotive sector provides 13.8 million jobs, representing 6.1% of total EU employment, and 2.6 million people work directly in manufacturing. One industry letter put the sector's contribution at roughly 7% of EU GDP. A prolonged chip disruption could idle factories across Germany, France, and Italy, further weakening a sector already squeezed by EV transitions and Chinese competition. The episode demonstrates how quickly supply chain measures aimed at national security can ricochet into economic blowback. Would European leaders still cheer US pressure on Chinese firms if it halts assembly lines in Stuttgart, Turin, or Detroit? And if chips for simple engine control units are weaponized, what happens when the dispute moves to advanced AI processors? Rare earth leverage, China's trump card. Behind the chip crisis lies a deeper resource play. On 9 October 2025, Beijing announced dramatic new export controls on rare earth elements ahead of the expected Trump-Xi summit. China added 5 heavy rare earths, holmium, erbium, thulium, europium, and ytterbium, to its control list and extended licensing requirements to foreign companies using Chinese materials. The rules require any foreign firm whose products contain or are made using Chinese rare earths or equipment to obtain an export license, even if no Chinese company is involved. Export approvals for defense end users would be denied, and permits for advanced semiconductor applications granted on a case-by-case basis. These moves are a potent bargaining chip because China produces over 90% of the world's processed rare earths and magnets. Rare earths are critical for everything from EV motors and wind turbines to fighter jets and missile guidance systems. By tightening controls just weeks before the summit, Beijing signaled it could throttle global supply chains if negotiations falter. US officials accused China of trying to exert control over the entire world's technology supply chains, while analysts noted the curbs increased Beijing's leverage. Rare earth truce and market fallout. The preliminary trade framework hammered out in Kuala Lumpur would reportedly pause these new controls for at least a year. But markets are quick to discount risk. When news of the truce spread, shares of US-listed rare earth miners slumped between 8.3% and 18% as investors unwound bets on prolonged shortages. Prior to the truce, rare earth miner valuations had surged on fears of supply constraints. The swift reversal shows how dependent miners are on geopolitics, and how easily investors can be whipsawed by daily headlines. How sustainable is a commodity strategy when a single announcement from Beijing can send rare earth stocks crashing? And does pausing an export ban for 12 months really change the long-term calculus for investors? Tariff tirades and market whiplash. Trump's threats of 100% tariffs on Chinese goods and his subsequent walkbacks triggered dizzying market swings. In mid-October, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said he and Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng would meet in Malaysia to try to defuse an escalation of US tariffs. Shortly after, Trump told Fox Business that the proposed 100% tariff is not sustainable, but that's what the number is, adding, "They forced me to do that." He confirmed he still planned to meet Xi and insisted he would secure a fair deal. These mixed messages whiplashed Wall Street. Major US stock indexes, rattled by abrupt tariff reimposition and regional bank concerns, swung into the green as the president softened his tone. Days later, after the Kuala Lumpur framework was announced, US stock index futures surged about 1%, while Japanese and South Korean benchmarks jumped more than 2% and Chinese indexes rose over 1% to 10-year highs. Gold prices fell nearly 2% as risk appetite improved. Yet rare earth miners tumbled on the same news. The message: markets crave stability more than bluster. Should global investors place bets on tweets and press conferences? Or do we need new metrics to navigate an era where trade policy lurches from one extreme to another within hours? Soybean politics. While China bought no US soybeans in September 2025 for the first time since 2018, a result of tariffs and plentiful supplies from Brazil, Trump insisted Beijing resume purchases. Soybeans matter politically. American farmers form a key part of his base. Analysts warn that Brazil's harvest will taper before the new crop comes in early spring, creating a window where China must either buy from the US or face a supply gap. In the Kuala Lumpur framework, China reportedly agreed to substantial purchases, causing soybean futures to jump 2%. Yet whether these promises become long-term contracts remains to be seen. Is soybean diplomacy sustainable, or will Chinese buyers again pivot to Brazil once the storm passes? And what does it mean for an entire crop's price to hinge on a handshake in a hotel ballroom? The gold shift. Amid trade volatility and geopolitical uncertainty, central banks have been quietly hedging. A September 2025 column noted that gold has overtaken the euro to become the second largest reserve asset after the US dollar. Central banks hold around 36,000 tons of gold. With bullion prices above $3,500 an ounce, the stash is worth about $4.5 trillion, more than the roughly $3.5 trillion in US treasuries. Gold's share of reserves stands near 27%, while treasuries have slipped to 23%. That marks the first time since 1996 that gold has eclipsed treasuries in official holdings. The surge reflects worries over inflation, US fiscal deficits, and geopolitical risk. It also highlights how central banks are diversifying away from the dollar, even as Washington insists on its financial dominance. When the world's central banks favor gold over US debt, are we witnessing a vote of no confidence in the dollar? If so, how might that reshape global finance in the coming decades? Europe's auto sector, a delicate balance. The Nexperia saga underscores a broader vulnerability: Europe's dependence on secure supply chains. Cars account for around 7% of EU GDP and support nearly 14 million jobs. In many countries, automotive exports underpin trade surpluses and fund social welfare. Disruptions to simple chips could shutter assembly lines from Wolfsburg to Detroit. Meanwhile, European automakers are losing ground. A McKinsey study reportedly finds European car companies have lost more than 13 percentage points of global market share since 2017, and their profitability has slumped, factors aggravated by Chinese competition and slow EV rollouts. Add in threatened US tariffs on European vehicles. Washington still levies 25% on some autos and has hinted at doubling that, and the pressure intensifies. If Europe's industrial heartland depends on chips packaged in China, can it afford to cheer when Washington squeezes Chinese tech firms? And at what point will EU leaders strike their own bargains, perhaps at odds with US policy? Looking ahead, questions at the APEC summit. As Trump and Xi head toward their Busan meeting, the world is asking, will this be a handshake that ends the trade war or just another pause before the next escalation? The preliminary consensus includes delaying China's rare earth curbs and pausing Trump's 100% tariff threat. It also promises renewed soybean purchases and cooperation on fentanyl precursors. Yet major questions remain unresolved, particularly export controls on advanced semiconductors. The White House has signaled that restrictions on companies more than 50% owned by banned entities, a rule that ensnared Nexperia, might stay in place. Beijing insists they are discriminatory. For Washington, the challenge is balancing domestic political theater with the geopolitical and economic realities of interdependence. For Beijing, it's about leveraging rare earths and vast consumer markets without triggering a full decoupling that could harm its own factories. For Europe and Japan, the goal is simply to keep their assembly lines running while the superpowers spar. Who wins this new trade diplomacy? Trump's Asia tour reveals a world in which political spectacle, resource leverage, and economic fragility intertwine. A president musing aloud about serving beyond constitutional limits can still broker ceasefires and sign major trade deals. A small country's expropriation of a chip firm can send shockwaves through global supply chains. A handful of obscure elements like holmium and erbium can suddenly become bargaining chips between superpowers. And behind the scenes, central banks quietly shift hundreds of billions of dollars into gold as insurance against it all. The red carpet ceremonies and Nobel nominations might grab headlines, but the real story is the subtle reshaping of global order. As Asia courts Washington with pomp and promises, it simultaneously diversifies its alliances and supply chains. As the United States demands loyalty through tariffs and trade deals, its own domestic politics raises questions about continuity and reliability. Europe, squeezed in the middle, watches its factories hang on the decisions of foreign governments. And Beijing, often portrayed as reactive, wields its rare earth monopoly with calculated precision. Is this truly the dawn of a multipolar world where smaller states play the giants off each other? Can the United States maintain its economic leverage while threatening its own supply chains with unsustainable tariffs? Will Europe's and Asia's red carpets eventually lead to a red line in the sand? These questions will shape not only the outcome of one summit, but the balance of power across the world in the decades to come.